Richard Hawthorne's voice took on a darker edge as he abandoned his pretense of reasonableness. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. My family has significant influence in this city. We know people who can make your life very difficult. Finding employment, getting credit, even renting an apartment can become challenging for people who make enemies of the wrong families." Jake felt Sarah's hand touch his arm, offering support as he dealt with the blatant threats. The former ranger had faced enemy combatants who promised far worse than economic harassment, and Richard Hawthorne's corporate intimidation tactics seemed almost quaint by comparison. "Mr. Hawthorne," Jake said quietly, "your son sexually assaulted someone, bragged about it publicly, and then attacked me when I suggested he leave. If you want to make this a public discussion about your family's values and behavior, I'm willing to have that conversation." The threat of publicity clearly struck a nerve. Richard Hawthorne's business success depended on maintaining a respectable image in Denver's business community. A detailed examination of his son's actions, complete with witness testimony and police reports, would be devastating to the family's reputation. "You're making a serious mistake," Richard said, his voice now openly hostile. "This matter could be resolved quietly and profitably for everyone involved. Instead, you're choosing to make it complicated. I hope you understand the consequences of that decision." Jake ended the call without responding to the final threat. He looked at Sarah, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand what they were dealing with. Her face showed a mixture of concern and determination that reminded Jake of his fellow soldiers when they faced a dangerous but necessary mission. "They're not going to let this go, are they?" Sarah asked. "Probably not," Jake admitted. "Rich bullies don't like being told no, especially by people they consider beneath them. They'll keep pushing until they either get what they want or face consequences they can't buy their way out of." Over the following week, Richard Hawthorne made good on his threats. Jake found his job search complicated by mysterious problems with references and background checks. Apartment rental applications were rejected without explanation. His bank notified him of concerns about his account status that required additional documentation and reviews. The harassment was subtle but persistent, designed to pressure Jake into accepting the Hawthorne family's terms without leaving evidence of deliberate interference. Richard Hawthorne was using his network of business connections to make Jake's life difficult while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. Sarah faced similar pressure at Murphy's Bar. The establishment suddenly failed health inspections that it had passed for years. Liquor license renewals encountered unexpected delays. City inspectors found building code violations that required expensive corrections. Patrick Murphy quickly realized that his bar was being targeted because of its association with Jake's confrontation with Brett Hawthorne. The elderly bar owner called Jake to discuss the situation, but not to blame him for the problems. Instead, Patrick wanted to coordinate their response to what was clearly an organized campaign of harassment. "I've dealt with corrupt officials and connected criminals before," Patrick told Jake during their meeting at Murphy's. "Back in Ireland and here in Denver. The one thing bullies like the Hawthornes can't stand is public attention to their methods. They depend on operating in shadows and making quiet threats." Patrick's solution was characteristically direct. He contacted a local investigative reporter named Jessica Chun who specialized in exposing corruption and abuse of power among Denver's elite. Jessica had been looking for a story that would demonstrate how wealthy families use their influence to escape consequences for their actions. The Hawthorne case was exactly what she had been seeking. A clear incident with multiple witnesses, police reports, and evidence of subsequent retaliation created a compelling narrative about justice and accountability in a city where money often mattered more than truth. Jessica's investigation revealed that the Hawthorne family's harassment campaign extended far beyond Jake and Murphy's Bar. Over the years, Richard Hawthorne had used similar tactics against business competitors, former employees who filed harassment complaints, and anyone else who crossed his family's interests. The reporter interviewed former employees of Hawthorne dealerships who described a pattern of sexual harassment and discrimination that was covered up through legal threats and financial settlements. She spoke with other business owners who had faced mysterious regulatory problems after refusing to sell their properties to Hawthorne development projects. Most damaging of all, Jessica discovered that Brett Hawthorne had been involved in at least 3 previous incidents involving allegations of sexual assault. In each case, the accusations had been quietly resolved through the family's lawyers and financial resources, with the victims signing non-disclosure agreements in exchange for monetary settlements. As Jessica's investigation progressed, Jake found himself reluctantly becoming a public figure. His military service and the circumstances of his confrontation with Brett made him a sympathetic protagonist in a story that resonated with many Denver residents who had felt powerless against wealthy bullies. Veterans organizations rallied to Jake's support, highlighting his honorable service and the challenges facing soldiers transitioning to civilian life. Women's advocacy groups praised his intervention on Sarah's behalf and used his story to illustrate the broader problem of sexual harassment and assault. The public attention had an immediate effect on the Hawthorne family's harassment campaign. City officials who had been cooperating with Richard Hawthorne's pressure campaign suddenly became unresponsive to his requests. Business associates began distancing themselves from the family as the negative publicity mounted. Richard Hawthorne attempted to control the narrative through his own media connections, but his efforts only drew more attention to his family's behavior. His claims that Jake was an unstable veteran who had attacked his son without provocation were quickly debunked by witness testimony and police reports. The breaking point came when Jessica Chun published a detailed investigation into the Hawthorne family's business practices and their son's history of alleged sexual assaults. The story ran on the front page of Denver's largest newspaper and was quickly picked up by national news outlets. Within hours of the story's publication, Richard Hawthorne was fielding phone calls from angry business partners, concerned investors, and family members who were horrified by the public exposure of their conduct. The car dealership chain that had been the foundation of the family's wealth began hemorrhaging customers and employees. Brett Hawthorne, meanwhile, was discovering that his privileged lifestyle had not prepared him for public scrutiny and social consequences. Friends and romantic prospects who had previously been attracted to his wealth and status now avoided him as news of his behavior spread through social media. The young man who had entered Murphy's bar believing himself untouchable was now facing the possibility of criminal charges as new victims came forward with allegations of sexual assault. The non-disclosure agreements that had previously silenced his accusers were being challenged in court by lawyers working pro bono for women's advocacy organizations. Richard Hawthorne made one final attempt to resolve the situation on his terms. He contacted Jake through an intermediary, offering a substantial financial settlement in exchange for a public statement absolving the Hawthorne family of wrongdoing and admitting that Jake had overreacted to a minor incident. The offer was substantial enough to secure Jake's financial future and end the harassment he had been enduring. All he had to do was lie about what had happened and allow the Hawthorne family to escape accountability for their actions. Jake's response was delivered through the same intermediary who had brought the offer. "Tell Mr. Hawthorne that some things aren't for sale. His son assaulted women and attacked me. No amount of money will change those facts or make me pretend they didn't happen." The rejection of their final offer forced the Jake's body moved with the fluid precision of countless hours of combat training. Without conscious thought, his left hand rose to deflect Brett's clumsy punch, while his right hand shot forward in a lightning-fast strike to Brett's solar plexus. The blow landed with surgical accuracy, driving the air from Brett's lungs and dropping him to his knees in less than 2 seconds. The young man gasped like a fish out of water, his expensive polo shirt suddenly feeling tight around his chest as he struggled to breathe. His friends stood frozen in shock, unable to process how quickly their leader had been neutralized by what appeared to be a simple defensive move. Jake stepped back immediately, his hands returning to his sides as he watched Brett struggle to catch his breath. The former Ranger's face showed no satisfaction or anger, only the calm professionalism of someone who had done exactly what was necessary, and nothing more. "Call an ambulance," Jake said quietly to Sarah, who was already dialing 911 behind the bar. The other patrons in Murphy's sat in stunned silence. Many of them had expected a prolonged fight, but the confrontation had ended before most people could even process what had happened. Jake's response had been so quick and controlled that it seemed almost anticlimactic. Brett's friends finally broke from their paralysis and rushed to his side. The young man was slowly regaining his ability to breathe, though each inhalation was still labored and painful. His face had gone from red with anger to pale with shock as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "What did you do to him?" one of Brett's friends demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. Jake looked at the young man with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the confrontation. "I defended myself," he said simply. "Your friend threw a punch. I stopped it." The friend opened his mouth to argue, but Brett raised a trembling hand to stop him. The young man was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible miscalculation. The stranger's casual competence and complete lack of emotion suggested a level of training and experience that Brett's sheltered life had never prepared him to encounter. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air outside Murphy's bar. Denver police officers entered first, followed closely by paramedics who immediately went to check on Brett. The young man was sitting up now, his breathing more normal but his face still pale with shock and embarrassment. Officer Maria Santos, a 10-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, took charge of the scene. She had responded to countless bar fights over the years, but something about this situation seemed different. The supposed aggressor was sitting calmly at the bar, making no attempt to flee or hide his involvement. The alleged victim was surrounded by friends, but showed no obvious signs of serious injury. "What happened here?" Officer Santos asked, addressing the room in general. Multiple witnesses began talking at once, each offering their version of events. Sarah, the bartender, provided the clearest account. She described Brett's harassment, his boasting about sexual assault, Jake's attempt to defuse the situation peacefully, and Brett's decision to throw the first and only punch. The paramedics confirmed that Brett had suffered no serious injuries beyond having the wind knocked out of him. His pride was bruised far more than his body, though he was experiencing some residual soreness in his chest where Jake's precisely placed strike had landed. Officer Santos interviewed Jake separately, noting his military bearing and the calm, factual way he described the events. When she asked about his background, Jake provided his military service record without prompting, including his ranger training and combat experience. "Mr. Morrison," Officer Santos said, "you used minimal force to stop an attack. From witness accounts, it appears you acted in self-defense. However, given your military training, you understand that your response carries different implications than it would for a civilian." Jake nodded, understanding the officer's concern. His specialized training meant that he was held to a higher standard when it came to the use of force. What might be considered reasonable self-defense for an ordinary citizen could be viewed as excessive when performed by someone with his capabilities. Brett's friends were growing increasingly agitated as they realized that their leader's actions had put him on the wrong side of the law. They began making phone calls, presumably to Brett's father and the family's lawyers. The young man himself remained largely silent, still processing the rapid reversal of his fortunes. When the paramedics offered to transport Brett to the hospital for observation, he declined. His injuries were minor, and he was beginning to understand that involving more authorities would only complicate his situation further. The last thing he wanted was for his father to discover the details of his behavior that evening. Officer Santos completed her preliminary investigation and determined that no arrests were necessary. The witness statements clearly indicated that Brett had initiated the physical confrontation, and Jake's response appeared proportional to the threat he faced. However, she advised both men that a formal report would be filed and that the district attorney's office would review the incident. As the police and paramedics prepared to leave, Brett's friends helped him to his feet. The young man was steady now, though his face still carried the pale complexion of someone who had received an unexpected and sobering lesson. He avoided eye contact with Jake as his group prepared to leave Murphy's bar. "This isn't over," one of Brett's friends muttered as they headed toward the door. Officer Santos heard the comment and turned sharply toward the group. "Actually, it is over," she said firmly. "Mr. Hawthorne threw the first punch and was lawfully defended against. Any attempt at retaliation or harassment will result in additional charges. I suggest you all go home and think carefully about the choices that led to tonight's incident." The group left without further comment, supporting Brett as they made their way to their expensive cars in the parking lot. Several other customers followed them out, deciding that the evening's excitement was enough entertainment for one night. Jake remained at the bar, finishing the beer that Sarah had poured him while the situation was being resolved. The bartender refused his offer to pay for the drink, expressing her gratitude for his intervention on her behalf. Other patrons nodded approvingly as they passed, recognizing that he had stood up for someone who couldn't defend herself. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said as she cleaned glasses behind the bar. "I'm used to dealing with jerks like that." Jake looked at her thoughtfully, seeing past her brave words to the relief in her eyes. "Nobody should have to get used to that," he said quietly. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Murphy's owner, an elderly Irish immigrant named Patrick Murphy, who had been running the bar for 30 years. He had been called about the incident and arrived expecting to deal with property damage and potential lawsuits. Instead, he found his bar largely intact and his staff grateful for Jake's intervention. After hearing the full story from Sarah and several customers, Patrick shook Jake's hand and declared that his drinks were free for the rest of the evening. "I've been dealing with entitled rich kids for 3 decades, Patrick said, his Irish accent still thick despite his years in Denver. "Most people are too intimidated by their money and connections to stand up to them. You did the right thing, son." As the evening wound down, Jake found himself reflecting on the events that had transpired. He had tried to avoid confrontation, but sometimes circumstances made conflict inevitable. His military training had prepared him for situations like this, but he took no pleasure in using those skills against fellow Americans, even ones who clearly deserved the lesson they had received. The incident reminded Jake of why he had chosen to build a quiet life after his military service. The world was full of bullies and predators who counted on good people to look the other way. Sometimes the only language they understood was the firm application of consequences for their actions. By the time Murphy's bar closed, word of the incident had already begun to spread through Denver's social media networks. Several customers had recorded videos of the aftermath, and Brett's humiliation was becoming public knowledge among his peer group. The young man who had entered the bar believing himself untouchable was learning that wealth and connections had limits. Jake drove home to his small apartment, knowing that the incident was far from over despite Officer Santos's words to Brett's friends. Young men like Brett rarely learned permanent lessons from single defeats, and their families had the resources to make life difficult for anyone who embarrassed them publicly. The former Ranger wasn't particularly worried about retaliation. He had faced far more dangerous enemies in Afghanistan than a spoiled rich kid with a bruised ego. What concerned him was the possibility that his attempt to live a normal civilian life might be compromised by the attention the incident would inevitably bring. Over the weekend, Jake's prediction proved accurate. Brett's father, Richard Hawthorne, was indeed a powerful figure in Denver's business community. His car dealerships employed hundreds of people, and his family donated significant amounts to local political campaigns and charities. The Hawthorne name carried weight in circles where money and influence mattered more than justice or truth. By Monday morning, Jake received a phone call from his supervisor at the construction company. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. Mr. Hawthorne had made several calls to the company's ownership, expressing concerns about employing someone with Jake's violent tendencies and military instability. The supervisor, a decent man named Tom Rodriguez, explained that the company was under pressure to terminate Jake's employment. Tom didn't agree with the decision, but the construction firm depended on contracts with several businesses owned by Hawthorne family associates. The economic pressure was too significant to ignore. Jake listened to the explanation without anger or surprise. He had seen similar scenarios play out during his military service, where politics and influence often mattered more than facts or merit. The wealthy and connected had ways of punishing those who crossed them that didn't require courts or legal proceedings. "I understand," Jake told Tom. "You've got a business to run and employees to protect. No hard feelings." Tom was relieved by Jake's mature response, but felt compelled to offer what help he could. He provided excellent references and promised to help Jake find work with other construction companies that were outside the Hawthorne family's sphere of influence. The job loss was a setback, but Jake had faced worse challenges during his transition to civilian life. He had savings to cover his expenses for several months, and his skills were in demand in Denver's growing construction market. More importantly, he had no regrets about his actions at Murphy's bar. That evening, Jake received an unexpected visitor at his apartment. Sarah, the bartender from Murphy's, stood nervously in his hallway holding a bottle of wine and a grocery bag filled with ingredients for dinner. "I heard what happened with your job," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "I wanted to thank you properly and maybe cook you dinner. It's the least I can do after you lost your job because of me." Jake invited her in, though he corrected her assumption about responsibility. "I didn't lose my job because of you," he said firmly. "I lost it because some people think money gives them the right to hurt others without consequences. That's not your fault." As Sarah prepared dinner in Jake's small kitchen, she shared her own story. She was a single mother working 2 jobs to support her 8-year-old daughter. Men like Brett were a regular part of her work environment, and she had learned to endure their harassment because reporting it often made her situation worse rather than better. "I've been working in bars and restaurants for 6 years, she explained as she chopped vegetables. "Every woman in this business has stories like the ones Brett was bragging about. Most of the time, we just have to smile and pretend it doesn't bother us because we need the tips and can't afford to make trouble." Jake listened with growing anger, not at Sarah but at a system that allowed predators to operate freely while their victims suffered in silence. His sister Emma had experienced similar treatment in different settings, and he knew that Brett's behavior represented a much larger problem than one drunk young man in a single bar. During dinner, Sarah asked about Jake's military service, and he shared some of his experiences in a way that few civilians had heard. He talked about the brotherhood among soldiers, the responsibility they felt to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and the difficulty of adjusting to a world where such principles were often seen as naive or outdated. "Do you regret what you did?" Sarah asked as they finished their meal. Jake considered the question carefully. His intervention had cost him his job and would likely bring additional complications into his life. Brett's family had the resources to make his situation very difficult if they chose to pursue their vendetta. "No," he said finally. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Some things are more important than keeping your head down and staying out of trouble." Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's phone ringing. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Against his better judgment, he answered the call. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice was older, authoritative, and carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is Richard Hawthorne. I believe you met my son Brett recently." Jake's expression hardened as he recognized the name. Sarah watched his face change and immediately understood who was calling. She moved closer, offering silent support as Jake dealt with what was clearly an unwelcome conversation. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hawthorne?" Jake asked, keeping his voice neutral and professional. Richard Hawthorne's tone was cold and threatening despite his polite words. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about Friday night's incident. My son tells me that you assaulted him without provocation. I'm willing to let this matter drop if you're prepared to be reasonable about compensation for his injuries and emotional trauma." The attempt at extortion was transparently obvious, but Jake had to admire the man's audacity. Richard Hawthorne was essentially demanding payment from the victim of his son's assault while threatening legal action if his demands weren't met. "Your son attacked me," Jake replied calmly. "I defended myself with minimal force. The police investigated and determined that no crime was committed. If you want to pursue legal action, you're welcome to try." There was a long pause on the other end of the line as Richard Hawthorne processed Jake's refusal to be intimidated. Clearly, the older man was accustomed to achieving his goals through a combination of financial pressure and legal threats. Jake's calm defiance was not the response he had expected or prepared for. The neon lights of Murphy's bar cast a red glow across Jake Morrison's weathered hands as he lifted his beer to his lips. After 18 months back from Afghanistan, the 28-year-old former Army Ranger still felt more comfortable in dimly lit corners than bright, open spaces. The bar was his usual Friday night refuge, a place where nobody asked questions about the scars on his knuckles or why he always sat with his back to the wall. Jake had chosen this particular stool because it gave him a clear view of both entrances, and the mirror behind the bar reflected the entire room. Old habits from his military days never truly died. His unit had been ambushed 3 times during his last deployment, and situational awareness had kept him alive when others hadn't been so lucky. The evening started like any other. Jake nursed his beer slowly, watching a basketball game on the television mounted above the bar. The familiar sounds of clinking glasses and casual conversation provided a comfortable background noise. He had learned to find peace in routine since returning home to Denver. His job at a construction company paid the bills, and these quiet evenings helped keep the nightmares at bay. Around 9:30, the atmosphere in Murphy's began to shift. A group of 5 men entered through the main door, their loud voices cutting through the usual bar chatter. Jake's trained eye immediately assessed them. Mid-20s, athletic builds, expensive clothes, and the kind of swagger that came from never being told no. College kids, probably, or recent graduates with trust funds and attitudes to match. The leader of the group was a tall blonde man wearing a designer polo shirt and a gold watch that cost more than Jake made in 3 months. His name was Brett Hawthorne, though Jake wouldn't learn that until later. Brett's father owned a chain of successful car dealerships across Colorado, and Brett had grown up believing his family's money made him untouchable. Brett and his friends ordered round after round of top-shelf liquor, their voices growing louder with each drink. They made crude comments about the female bartender, Sarah, a single mother who had been working at Murphy's for 2 years. Jake watched as Sarah's smile became more forced with each inappropriate joke and unwanted advance from the group. When Brett grabbed Sarah's wrist as she tried to clear their empty glasses, Jake's body tensed. The trained soldier in him recognized a threat developing, but the civilian he was trying to become told him to stay out of other people's business. Sarah pulled her hand free and stepped back, but Brett and his friends only laughed louder. Jake finished his beer and placed a $20 bill on the bar, planning to leave before the situation escalated. He had learned the hard way that his military training made him react differently to confrontations than most people expected. The last thing he wanted was trouble that might jeopardize his construction job or his attempts to build a normal life. As Jake stood to leave, Brett's voice carried across the bar with crystal clarity. He was telling his friends about his latest conquest, describing in graphic detail what he had done to some girl the previous weekend. The way he talked made it clear he wasn't describing a consensual encounter. Jake's hands clenched into fists as memories of his sister flashed through his mind. Jake's sister Emma had been attacked during her sophomore year of college. The case never went to trial because the perpetrator's wealthy family had connections and expensive lawyers. Emma had struggled with depression and anxiety for years afterward, and Jake had watched helplessly as his bright, confident sister became a shadow of her former self. The similarities between Brett's casual boasting and what had happened to Emma were too close for Jake to ignore. He remained standing by his stool, his body coiled with tension as he listened to Brett describe how he had ignored the girl's protests and continued anyway. Brett's friends laughed and encouraged him to share more details. Sarah appeared beside Jake, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly as she collected his empty beer bottle. She had heard Brett's story too, and the combination of his earlier harassment and his current bragging had clearly upset her. "You okay?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying the concern of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. Sarah nodded, but her forced smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just another Friday night," she said, but Jake could hear the exhaustion in her voice. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with customers like Brett, and it wouldn't be the last. Brett noticed Jake watching and misinterpreted his attention as admiration. The young man raised his glass in Jake's direction with a cocky grin. "You hear that story, man? That's how you handle these college girls. They say no, but they don't really mean it. You know what I'm saying." Jake's military training had taught him to control his emotions in high-stress situations, but Brett's casual attitude towards sexual assault was pushing him past his breaking point. The construction worker forced himself to remain calm, knowing that losing his temper would only make things worse for everyone involved. "I think you've had enough to drink," Jake said evenly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Brett's friends fell silent, sensing the change in atmosphere. They looked between their friend and the serious-faced man standing near the bar. Something in Jake's posture and tone warned them that this wasn't a typical bar patron they could intimidate or brush off. Brett, however, was too drunk and too accustomed to getting his way to recognize the warning signs. He slid off his bar stool and approached Jake with the unsteady confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Excuse me," Brett said, his voice rising with indignation. "I don't remember asking for your opinion, buddy. Why don't you mind your own business and go back to your corner before you get yourself in trouble?" Jake remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Brett's face. Years of combat experience had taught him to read people quickly and accurately. He could see the entitled rage building in Brett's expression, the kind of anger that came from someone unused to being challenged. The other customers in Murphy's began to notice the tension. Conversations quieted as people turned to watch the confrontation developing between the obviously intoxicated young man and the calm, controlled figure who stood like a statue near the bar. Sarah moved behind the counter, her hand reaching for the phone to call the police if necessary. She had seen enough bar fights to know when a situation was about to explode, and the atmosphere in Murphy's had become electric with potential violence. "Look," Jake said, keeping his voice reasonable and non-threatening. "Nobody wants any trouble here. Just finish your drinks and head home. Everyone goes their separate ways, no problems." Brett laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. The alcohol and his friend's watching eyes had convinced him that backing down wasn't an option. In his mind, this stranger was challenging not just his words, but his entire identity as someone who took what he wanted without consequences. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" Brett asked, stepping closer to Jake. "You think you can just tell me what to do? Do you have any idea who my father is? Do you know what kind of connections my family has in this city?" Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes that would have warned a more sober observer. The former soldier had heard similar threats from enemy combatants who thought their family names or tribal connections would save them. Those threats had never impressed him in Afghanistan, and they certainly didn't impress him now. "Your father isn't here," Jake replied simply. The words hit Brett like a slap across the face. His friends exchanged nervous glances, beginning to understand that their leader had chosen the wrong target for his drunken bravado. The stranger wasn't backing down or showing the fear they expected from someone confronted by their group. Brett's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He had never been dismissed so casually, especially not in front of his friends and a bar full of witnesses. His wealthy upbringing had insulated him from the kind of direct confrontation where words and family connections meant nothing. The young man reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, waving it threateningly at Jake. "One phone call," he said, his words slurred but his meaning clear. "One phone call, and I can make your life very difficult. I can find out who you are, where you work, where you live. You want to play games with me?" Jake looked at the phone, then back at Brett's face with an expression of mild curiosity. He had faced roadside bombs, enemy snipers, and mortar attacks during 3 tours of duty. The threat of a spoiled rich kid with a cell phone didn't register on his scale of things to worry about. The silence stretched between them as the rest of the bar waited to see what would happen next. Sarah clutched the phone behind the counter, ready to dial 911 at the first sign of physical violence. The other patrons had stopped pretending to watch the television and were now openly staring at the confrontation. Brett's friends began to realize that their leader was making a serious mistake. The stranger's calm confidence suggested he wasn't someone who could be intimidated by threats or family connections. They started to move closer, not to support Brett's confrontation, but to try to defuse it before things got out of hand. "Come on, Brett," one of them said nervously. "Let's just go to that other place we talked about. This bar is getting boring anyway." But Brett was past the point of listening to reason. The alcohol, his wounded pride, and years of getting his way through intimidation had combined into a dangerous cocktail. He was committed to this confrontation now, unable to back down without losing face in front of his friends. "No," Brett said firmly, never taking his eyes off Jake. "This guy thinks he can embarrass me in front of everyone. He thinks he's better than me. I want to know what makes him so special." Jake remained motionless, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his body ready to react if the situation turned physical. He had hoped to avoid this kind of confrontation, but his military experience had taught him that some fights were inevitable once they reached a certain point. The former ranger could see several ways the situation might unfold, and most of them ended badly for Brett. Jake's training and experience gave him advantages that the drunk young man couldn't possibly understand. What worried Jake was that those advantages might be too much, that he might seriously hurt someone who was more foolish than truly evil. Brett stepped even closer, now close enough that Jake could smell the expensive cologne mixed with alcohol on his breath. The young man's friends hung back, torn between loyalty and self-preservation as they watched their leader escalate a confrontation he couldn't win. "So what's your story?" Brett asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "What makes you think you're so tough? You work construction or something? Drive a truck? Let me guess, you're one of those guys who thinks physical labor makes you a real man." Jake's jaw tightened slightly at the casual dismissal of honest work, but he didn't respond to the insults. He had learned long ago that words couldn't hurt him, and responding to verbal provocation often made situations worse than they needed to be. The silence seemed to infuriate Brett even more. He had expected fear, anger, or at least some kind of reaction to his taunts. The stranger's complete composure was undermining everything Brett thought he knew about intimidation and confrontation. "Answer me," Brett shouted, his voice echoing through the now silent bar. "I'm talking to you. Don't you dare ignore me." The outburst crossed a line that even Brett's friends couldn't ignore. They moved closer, ready to physically restrain their leader if necessary. The situation had moved beyond drunken bravado into something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Jake finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in life and death situations. "You need to leave now. Take your friends, walk out that door, and don't come back tonight. This is your last chance to make the smart choice." The words weren't a threat or a challenge. They were simply a statement of fact delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of doing if the situation required it. Jake hoped that Brett would recognize the warning for what it was and choose to walk away. Instead, Brett interpreted Jake's final warning as the ultimate insult. In his alcohol-clouded mind, this stranger was treating him like a child who could be dismissed with a few stern words. The humiliation of being ordered around in front of his friends and a bar full of witnesses pushed him beyond rational thought. Brett drew back his right hand and threw a wild, uncontrolled punch aimed at Jake's face. It was the kind of sloppy, telegraphed attack that someone with real fighting experience could see coming from across the room. For Jake, who had survived hand-to-hand combat in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, it might as well have been thrown in slow motion.